So let's begin. How many of you chuckled when you saw this image? This cartoon hangs in the office of our founder, Mrs. Holliday, at the museum, and I have used it for many years as an icebreaker for my talks, as a moment of possibility from the dawn of art and history. But less than a decade ago, an article in National Geographic actually addressed just this issue of authorship. Entitled, "Were the First Artists Mostly Women?" Archaeologist Dean Snow made a cogent, if controversial, scientific argument that 3/4 of painted handprints in ancient caves in Europe were made by women. How did he figure this out? Well, it turns out that in studying our Paleolithic ancestors, British biologists have discovered that men and women had very different hand types, more distinctive than today. Women had index and ring fingers that were of the same length, while men's ring fingers were much longer than their index finger. So take a look at your own hands, and then compare them with someone of the opposite sex, and then take a look at this photograph again. If indeed, as the New Yorker cartoon suggests, and new scientific research shows, women are responsible for many of the great cave paintings in Spain and France, doesn't this upend your thinking about women artists from the very start? Well, that's my purpose today, to get you to think differently. I want to get at what I call the naked truth when it comes to women in the arts. Sounds like a great film noir to me, something we'd all like to see, bringing women out of the darkness and into the light. So now that we've reoriented our thinking by going back some 20,000 plus years, I want to fast forward to today, to this great broadside by the Guerrilla Girls, which paints a very different picture. Today, I am pleased to talk about the National Museum of Women in the Arts, the first major museum in the world solely dedicated to championing women in and through the arts. And I want to put the museum in context. In answer to the naked truth revealed in this poster, NIMWA addresses the ongoing gender imbalance in the presentation of art by bringing to light important international women artists of the past, starting in the 16th century in Europe, and we promote great artists working today. For the past decade, the museum also has been looking at and aggregating statistics around women artists and women leaders, the art market, museums, art fairs, awards, etc., in order to inspire dynamic exchanges about better representation of women and those who identify as women in the arts. Here is just a sampling of the statistics that you can find on our website. Isn't big data just amazing? It's important to realize that even now in the United States, when 46% of working artists are women, earnings inequality is still very real, and it gets worse with age. When women artists are over 65, they earn less than 66 cents to men artists' dollar. This trend begins right after graduate school, with only 30% of women artists achieving gallery representation, and only 10 to 30% of solo gallery shows each year being those of women. Regarding the art market, a recent ArtNet study released in 2019 has told us that more than $196 billion was spent on art over the past 11 years. Of this, work made by women accounts for just $4 billion, or around 2%. For context, Works by Pablo Picasso generated $4.8 billion at auction during the same period. That $4.8 billion spent on Picasso is more than the total spent on every single woman artist in ArtNet's data set combined, which is almost 6,000 women. It's also interesting to note that $1.5 billion of the $4 billion spent on women was spent on 5 artists: Yayoi Kusama, Joan Mitchell, Louise Bourgeois, Georgia O'Keeffe, and Agnes Martin, the last 4 of which are actually artist estates. The dynamic that starts with galleries and moves to the art market and collectors is also true of museums. Although progress has been made by women over the past 30+ years, there is still a major gap that needs to be addressed in US and international museums. And it is even worse for women of color, especially African American artists. They are nearly invisible. You can see from this chart that who is represented in museums is not an accurate reflection of reality, but rather a reading of history that favors one group over all others, a pattern that began in the past and continues today, a pattern that began with the hierarchies that were placed upon art and art making that excluded women from men's midst. The same inequities can be found in awards and prizes and for nearly all the major international biennials, triennials, and documentas. Venice in 2019 was the one exception, capping off a trend for greater representation of women artists that began with Maria de Corral and Rosa Martinez's 2005 biennial, which has been called the Women's Biennial because it was the first time 2 women commissioners oversaw and shaped this international event. Does this give us hope? Well, certainly. Can it be repeated? We shall see, and we'll see that soon when Cecilia Alemany, Italy's first woman biennial commissioner, puts forward her Biennale in the coming years. So where does NIMWA fit in? Well, here at the Women's Museum, we know that if women artists are valued in our cultural landscape, the case for women across our entire social landscape can and will be improved. Because the arts are often a bellwether, as we collectively seek to treat boys and girls the same way, as contemporary artist Jenny Holzer often says. And while certainly there are arts institutions who are doing much better than these overall stats, we should not fool ourselves. The question around equal representation regularly resurfaces because people like us believe that we're reaching parity, that's P-A-R-I-T-Y, at a more rapid rate than we actually are. Not just in the art world, but in society in general, whether it's the top CEOs, boardrooms, elected officials, in financial institutions, tech startups, etc. 33 years ago, NIMWA's founder, Wilhelmina Cole Holliday, and her husband, Wallace, recognized the power of art and the importance of women in art and in the world. Mrs. Holliday just saw things differently. For a patrician woman, she knew that reinserting women into art history and championing contemporary women artists was going against the grain and that it was controversial. In the wake of the women's movement, she wanted to bring women artists into the mainstream, and the private nonprofit museum she created signaled a major social and cultural shift in our thinking.
When it opened, it was quite controversial.
Well, the feminists came and they said, this is some white glove establishment, this is not for us. And the old dowagers came and said, this is some feminist thing, they all printed it everywhere. And it helped put us on the map. My response was, you are absolutely right. It would be ideal if all the art was treated equally. Unfortunately, it's not.
I also believe that it is no accident that the museum ended up in two buildings that were previously off limits to women. Our main building used to be DC's Masonic headquarters, and the Kasser wing was a porno parlor called the Brown Bagger. I feel that we were meant to repurpose these traditionally male spaces that were forbidden to women into a museum for women in the arts. A Delta of Venus, as I call it, pointed directly at Treasury and the White House. Given our location in Washington, I like to think of NIMWA as a shining beacon of light and reason. But if it were not for the Prado, NIMWA might never have come to be. The Prado is at the center of our founding myth. That was where Mrs. Holliday had her eureka moment, in front of the breakfast still lives of Clara Peters, an artist whose works she and Wally fell in love with during a visit to Spain in the 1970s. The story continues that when the Hollidays returned to the United States, they tried to find out more about the artist by consulting the leading textbooks in art history, Jansen's History of Art and Gardner's Art Through the Ages. Discovering that Peters was not in those texts and realizing that not a single other woman artist was in those texts as well, the Hollidays determined that they would focus their collection on women artists, and this became the seed from which the museum eventually grew. So here at NIMWA, we lead by shedding light on women artists of the past, offering up moments of exceptional achievement beginning with the 16th century. The historical works are the strength and treasure trove of the Holliday donation, which now numbers over 600 objects. Whether it's a painter like the great Elisabetta Sirani on the left, Judith Leister of Holland, who in the 19th century had an unscrupulous dealer cover up her signature in favor of painting it over with Frans Hals in hopes of making more money. She obviously was Hals' equal. And then there's Vigée Lebrun, the first woman to be accepted into the Académie des Beaux-Arts and court painter to Marie Antoinette. We have 3 impressive portraits by Lebrun, as well as a sketchbook from her Russian period when she was invited and welcomed by Catherine the Great during the French Revolution. Let's go back to the 16th century to Italy, where NIMWA's collection begins, to the Renaissance, where the concept of genius was first articulated, and Lavinia Fontana was one such. Acknowledged as the first professional woman artist of the Renaissance, her portrait of a nobleman is one of the first paintings the Hollidays purchased for their collection. While we don't know who the sitter is, we know that she is high-born and that this is most likely this young woman's wedding portrait. She's about 13 years old. You can see the cross is her symbol of piety. The dog, the cane bolognese, is a symbol of loyalty or fidelity. Red is the typical color for a bolognese wedding dress of that era. Her clothes and gems are typical of a wealthy woman's trousseau and symbols of her rich dowry. Having gazed upon this perfect example of demure womanhood, it's safe to assume that our artist Fontana was just like the women she depicted, right? Well, apparently not. While there are certain similarities, Fontana did not spend her youth at home or in a convent. Rather, as you likely know from the recent exhibition of her work held at the Prado, she attended the University of Bologna. and was in fact a person of prodigious learning, having earned a doctorate from the university, one of the few places in Europe where women were able to study the classics. And in this self-portrait on the left, she looks out at us and shows herself to be that accomplished and cultivated woman. Fontana truly was a Renaissance woman and the artistic equal to the Renaissance man, setting the stage for those who came after her. While you have these exceptional women from Fontana to Vigée-Lebrun and beyond, it's really in the 19th and early 20th century that women truly begin to claim their place. In early 20th century figurative art, you have Suzanne Valadon on the left, who was overlooked for many years in favor of her son, Maurice Utrillo, the painter of Montmartre. And then in the center, Sonia Delaunay, who brought her colorful brand of cubism that she created with her husband Robert into the spheres of fashion, design, and everyday life. And at the right, you have Spanish-born surrealist Remedios Barro, who along with her friend, Leonora Carrington, took surrealism in a different direction from Freud and took it away from the misogyny so common amongst male surrealists. The most famous artwork in our collection is another figurative painting from this period, the self-portrait dedicated to Leon Trotsky by Frida Kahlo. It is the only Frida Kahlo in a public collection in DC, and it was given to Mrs. Holliday by the Honorable Claire Booth Luce in 1988 when the museum opened. Like many paintings by Kahlo, this one focuses on a particular event in the artist's life. It was created as a birthday present for the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky to commemorate his brief affair with Kahlo, which occurred shortly after his arrival in Mexico in 1937. In this painting, she presents herself elegantly clothed, holding a bouquet of flowers and a letter of dedication to Trotsky that states, "Con todo cariño," with all my affection. Like many women artists working in the decades just after the revolution, Kahlo was influenced in her life and art by the nationalistic movement known as Mexicanidad. She often wore the distinctive clothing of the Tehuantepec women of Southwest Mexico, and she looked to Mexican folk art for inspiration. In this work, Kahlo draws upon Mexican retablos, vernacular devotional images of the Virgin Mary, which she collected, casting herself as a new female icon, which she inevitably became. Given Kahlo's involvement with communism and the Mexican Revolution, as well as that of her husband Diego Rivera, it is interesting that this is the one and only Kahlo painting in a public collection in Washington, D.C., the capital of the Democratic Republic. I often wonder if Mrs. Luce, who was a great stateswoman, thought about when she offered this work to our founder. In addition to celebrating our female forebears, who we fondly refer to as our old mistresses versus your old masters, Nimwa also advocates for better representation of contemporary women artists in museums, galleries, auctions, and art fairs. Our very presence, our very being, gives us the imprimatur to advocate for that. And it is in the area of modern and contemporary art where the greatest growth is taking place in our collection. We are actively building a remarkably rich and diverse collection for the future in these time frames. And on the left, you'll see a large corrugated metal sculpture by Linda Benglis that looks like fabric. Mickaleen Thomas's portrait of an African-American woman made from shiny pink paint and jet black beads. And then on the right, a hypnotic photograph of a woman falling through a wedding dress by Charlotte Gillenhammer. For our 30th anniversary 3 years ago, the museum purchased this major Faith Ringgold starry quilt featuring iconic performer Josephine Baker. Ringgold herself is justly famous for embracing figurative art in the late 50s and 1960s, when abstract art held sway over the art world. Ringgold also was a leader in the civil rights movement as well as the feminist movement. She was, in fact, the first person ever to organize a protest against a museum for racial and gender bias in the 1960s, against the Whitney Museum of Art. Given Ringgold's history as an artist and an organizer, it's especially significant that we own her story quilt called Joe Baker's Bananas. For those of you who may not know much about Josephine Baker, she was a great performer. And here in Ringgold's quilt, Baker performs her famous Danse Sauvage at the Folies Bergères. For Ringgold, Baker was a radical soulmate, a woman who in the 1920s also challenged traditional notions of race and gender. In Joe Baker's Bananas, Faith Ringgold allies herself with Baker and foregrounds the issues of gender and racial equity that she has fought for all of her life, and which we are all still talking about so much today. All in the hope that change is possible and that the arts have a role to play. Another recent purchase is this wall-sized Lala Essaydi. Essaydi is a Moroccan-born artist and photographer, and her art investigates the multifaceted identity of Muslim women in beautiful, intricate, and very large photographs. Essaydi was one of 12 remarkable women photographers featured in the exhibition She Who Tells a Story, Women Photographers from Iran and the Arab World. What could be more typical in our thinking about the Middle East than an odalisque? And at first, that is all we see, a dark-haired beauty lying on a bed covered in gauze with henna calligraphy. This staged photograph simultaneously entices us with beauty and also subtly confronts us with an act of violence, the fragmentation of the body into 3 parts, like a woman sawed into pieces in an old magic act. But what else? Let's take a closer look. Essaydi has covered the daybed and the walls with bullet casings. She takes the European ideal of the odalisque, the harem dweller, and reinterprets it through contemporary eyes as a commentary on the violence that has impacted her world, a violence that spans the time from colonialism to the present. Unlike a typical odalisque, the oft recumbent concubine with a come-hither gaze, available for our delectation, this figure is not ours for the taking. She confronts us. She lies flat and is unbending in her position and challenges us to resist the stereotype. And then, as a final element, Essaydi has used henna to create stream of consciousness calligraphy all over this woman's shroud and body. This, too, is a subversive act, because the written word in Islamic culture has always been the domain of men. Here, in this larger-than-life photograph, Essaydi is giving her subject a voice and an image, one that asks us to confront our own cultural biases and look to the nuances of women's condition in the Middle East. In contextualizing the National Museum of Women in the Arts, the person I look to most often lately is Elizabeth Merritt, the founding director of the Alliance of American Museums Center for the Future of Museums. Elizabeth is always interested in the ways in which we can move beyond being stewards of the past to thinking of ourselves as keepers of the future. She talks about museums helping people to intentionally shape the way they want the world to change. And one of the ways she posits we can do this is by detoxifying the past. When Elizabeth looks at Nimwa, she sees the museum not only as developing a collection or having exhibitions and programs that embrace change, she places us within this context of detoxification of the past. creating disruption to false narratives or past omissions caused by gender inequality, removing power from the system of oppression of women of color and white women, and working to create resources through the arts that increase equity for all women in the larger world. Elizabeth states categorically that the days of museums being seen as unbiased repositories is over. We are trusted institutions in society, but to maintain that trust, a certain level of self-reflection and activism is absolutely appropriate to museums, each depending on their mission. Because in everything we do as museums, what we choose to collect, what we choose to exhibit, how we choose to give people voice and vision, we are making decisions that can either help create the kind of world we want to live in the future or hinder it. So as we choose to work toward detoxifying the past at the Women's Museum, there are 4 initiatives I especially wanted to introduce to you today. First is our changing thematic installations of our collection. Not only does this approach break the stranglehold of historical chronology that shortchanges the work of women of color and women, it also elucidates and stakes out new territory where women have helped drive artistic discourse, especially today. For most museum visitors who are used to chronology, showing artworks thematically is surprising and even unsettling. Taking in distinct types of work and different media, styles and periods of art all at the same time in the same gallery takes a bit of adjustment, but it's well worth the effort in order to think differently. If you were to visit the museum now, our current themes include Rebels with the Cause, Family Matters, Women and Nature, and Roots and Roots. And like a changing exhibition, we have a rich enough collection now to develop new themes each and every year. As a young cause-related, mid-sized institution with a collection of over 5,500 works, this is much easier for us to accomplish than it is for large, encyclopedic, established museums like the Prado and others. And I think the fact that we're privately funded also is a great help to us as well. The second initiative is our unique program of state and international committees. These are very different than friends groups that support many museums financially, because our groups have more of an advocacy role. Our 27 committees, and there is one here in Madrid, chaired by a dedicated arts professional who is probably familiar to you. It's Sofia Barroso of Around Art. With Sofia's leadership, our committee advocate at a grassroots level for the cause of women artists in this region and many others, as well as spotlighting the work of the Women's Museum. Our committee's goals are to develop meaningful outreach programming for artists and to work with museums like the Prado and many others in collaboration, to build bridges that will eventually assure that contemporary women artists achieve as much attention as their male counterparts. The signature collaboration between the committees and the museum is the highly acclaimed Women to Watch series, held at Nîmes every 2 to 3 years. Women to Watch embodies the museum's commitment to presenting emerging, underrepresented, or underappreciated artists from different parts of the world. And it foregrounds the vital role that the museum's outreach committees play in their region by bringing new artists to our attention, as well as introducing us to curators who are making strides in the field. Whether it's Women to Watch Organic Matters, High Fiber, Heavy Metal, these shows break down stereotypes also about what women artists do. They also introduce new trends in contemporary art where women exceed and excel and lead the pack. In our 2020 exhibition, Paper Roots, working with our committee and Amparo Lopez Corral, Spain was represented by Luisa Pastor. Her intricate paperworks made from thrown-away materials often contain trenchant commentaries that deconstruct societal values on race and ethnicity, including histories of miscegenation, in order to offer new meanings. COVID, the pandemic, has given us the opportunity to amplify the voices of women to watch artists like Pastor and others through virtual studio visits, blogs, audio guides, and other digital engagements. And that kind of work will continue well into the future. On site at the museum, our Women Arts and Social Change programming is the third initiative I wanted to speak about today. It explicitly links female artists with female leaders in a variety of fields, all of whom are catalysts for change, especially as it impacts women and girls. Located as we are in our nation's capital, the museum is uniquely suited to provide that steady drumbeat of curated advocacy programming wrapped around women in the arts, and we have found the diverse intergenerational audience to support it. Normally, our signature Fresh Talks are held in the museum's performance hall, but ever since we started 5 years ago, we also have live streamed these events so that anywhere in the world you can be part of the program in real time or view the event afterwards via YouTube. With this initiative, as with our committees, NIMWA has moved beyond bricks and mortar in order to reach out around the globe with programming with a socially conscious purpose. In a way, I've already been talking about the fourth and final initiative I wanted to touch on today, outreach via the digital sphere. This was a very powerful and important space for us, even before the pandemic. More so perhaps than for traditional museums, because our mission is also a cause. The digital sphere links us internationally with people like you who believe in our mission. At roughly the same time we began our Fresh Talks, we also launched our catalytic #5WomenArtists digital outreach campaign. When the program began some 6 years ago, it was a public awareness campaign, asking the simple question, can you name 5 women artists? We laid bare women artists' continued invisibility and advocated for changing this systemic omission in the art world. We've partnered on this initiative with the Tate Modern and the Met, the Uffizi and the Baltimore Museum, Musée d'Orsay, the Brooklyn Museum, the Jewish Museum in New York, as well as working with a huge number of other arts organizations and individuals who have taken up the challenge. 3 years into this project, we intentionally moved from awareness to action, challenging museums and arts organizations and individuals to pledge to do one or more of 4 things to create greater gender and social equity. This challenge including a higher percentage of women the next time a museum rehangs a collection, acquiring works by women artists in greater numbers, increasing the number of artists in exhibitions, and including women of color. Now, 6 years on in our #5 initiative, we have embraced a huge community. 1,800 museums and cultural organizations from 57 countries and 7 continents. 272 museums have taken up the challenge and signed our pledge and are actively working to become more inclusive of women artists. The next direction we are taking this project is to connect our digital outreach for the campaign to the innovative programming we are creating on-site at the museum. And in a year or so, we will launch our own qualitative Women in the Arts survey, creating new data that will inform this network's future efforts on behalf of women artists. There is a recognition and a reckoning happening in the art world Too slowly, for sure, but as we look systemically to detoxify the past in order to decolonize the future, women are and will be central to that story. And to achieve this, it is all about connecting the art, the public, technology, and all of our activities to better serve our cause, allow for many voices and viewpoints as we champion women in and through the arts. Never was this more true than over the past year with the pandemic. The digital sphere became a lifeline as never before to our audiences, as for almost every other museum around the globe, making us rethink again how we react, interact, and serve the public to help build a better future. When I began this talk, I offered up a set of statistics that demonstrated how difficult it is to create systemic change for women artists. I thought I would end by offering a few concrete examples of how that can be changed. There are, of course, many more arts institutions than these that are doing great work to foreground women artists, and many more examples of how this change is happening, but here are a few. I'd like to start by mentioning that our museum has several sister institutions, including the Spelman College Museum of Art, which was founded in 1996, which takes up the cause of women of the African diaspora. Perhaps best known is the Center for Feminist Art, embedded within the Brooklyn Museum. Founded in 2007, it is a nexus for feminist art, theory, and activism, and is overseen by curator Catherine Morris. The Aware Archives in Paris was created in 2014 and is directed by Camille Morineau. Its purpose is the creation, documentation, and distribution of information on women artists of the 20th century. As the statistics make clear, there continues to be a need for these kinds of women artist or woman-centric institutions to be founded and to be funded. Also coming full circle to the beginning of my talk, I want to recognize that there are great exhibitions of women artists out there, which we all know. And I applaud the way in which the Prado has taken up the cause of historically important women artists. It is so validating when major national institutions like the Prado, with international reach, create new exhibitions that follow in NIMWA's curatorial footsteps from the 1990s, bringing Anguissola and Fontana to greater prominence, as well as realizing a major exhibition about Clara Peters. It is important that each generation learn about these artists anew. It also is galvanizing when institutions introduce a new artist to the public, like Hilma af Klint, which the Guggenheim did in 2019. Thanks to their partnership with the Moderna Museet in Stockholm, Klint is now recognized as the first non-representational painter in Western modern art. This show was a major correction to the historical record, as her abstract art predates that of Vasily Kandinsky, which the Guggenheim actually has major holdings in. Regarding collecting, in the US, we've also seen a major shift at institutions like the LA County Museum of Art, where 70% of their contemporary purchases and 35% of their historical purchases over the past 5 years have been art by women, including The Education of the Virgin that you see on the screen now by Louisa Rodin. Or the Baltimore Museum of Art, which has publicly taken a new direction to enfranchise people of color and white women by deaccessioning contemporary works by white men. This bold move has garnered a great deal of criticism, but it certainly has also brought this idea to the art world's attention. My time is nearly up. So in closing, I'm often asked what will happen to NIMWA when women achieve equal representation in the art world. And my response is that I hope to live to see that day, in the arts as well as in society as a whole. But even when that day comes and parity is achieved, the Women's Museum will always have a place in this world because there will always be great contemporary women artists for us to show and an illustrious history for us to tell, a history we are helping and you are helping to create. As a coda to my talk, I would like to dedicate this talk to Wilhelmina Cole Holliday, NIMWA's visionary founder, who passed away on March 6th of this year at the age of 98. She lived to see her dream fulfilled, and we are proud to carry on her legacy.